And although I regularly attend a Pulaski Mennonite church, I have a strong connection to this church. My grandfather attended here after he retired as a pastor, and I think stood at this pulpit, although it was probably the old church, and I think it was the other direction, wasn't it? And I think my dad's been here and spoken a couple times, and so, although I've got two brothers that are preachers, I didn't expect to be here, but it's good to be here. One thing I noticed, you don't have a clock on the back wall, so Mom, it's your job if I get too long.
You got one right there.
Okay, good. That's good, that's better. It's covered by the angel, though. I'm going to start today with, we've got two passages. I'm going to start with the Old Testament reading. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it's several excerpts. So I'll tell you the beginning verse if you're wanting to read along, and then as I skip to the next verse, the next excerpt, I'll let you know what that is. So this is from the New Revised Standard Version. Verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered in Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Ezekah, in Ephes-Dammim, starting at verse 4. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze in his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today, if I defy the ranks of Israel, give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elam, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with him, then the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up to the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. Now verse 32. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him. You are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David in his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried to walk in vain, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. the Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with the sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you to my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell down, and he fell face down on the ground. The New Testament reading is from Mark 4, verses 35 to 41. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern and asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Thus ends the reading of the word. May it be blessed. So I have to confess, these two stories are everybody knows them, right? So adding a new touch to them can be a little challenging. And I had some ideas, but this is not my regular gig, and so I turned to the internet and got a little help. So I've borrowed heavily in the message, but I think the sentiments are in keeping with what I wanted to say. So I hope you'll forgive me for using someone else's assistance. Let's bow our heads in for opening prayer. Keeper of our lives, you know the hardness and the gentleness of human hearts. You call your people to faithful living. Through the storms of life that bring suffering and fear, joy and laughter, teach us to recognize your gifts in us, so that we may come to know your presence in the midst of the joys and trials that surround us. Amen. In God we trust. Did you know that this is the official motto of the United States? It became the nation's motto in 1956. And I think it's great that on our money, that thing that we often think of as a necessity, a source of security and sustenance, is this reminder: in God we trust. It's a simple sentence, 4 words, 4 syllables, but the meaning isn't so simple. What is trust? What is faith? These are questions that I ask myself. In fact, most days I ask myself, what is God, if I'm honest? We hear stories of healing by faith. The Bible is full of examples of faith being tested and faith being rewarded. The 2 stories we heard today have examples of faith in action. David defeated Goliath. Jesus calmed the storm. Both are examples of God working through men. But in both stories, there are also examples of a lack of faith. David's brothers like many older brothers, didn't believe that their youngest brother would deliver victory. And Jesus' companions felt no assurance of safety as the winds kicked up and the sea began to swamp the boat. If brothers of a king-to-be and disciples lacked faith, how are we, ordinary, everyday people, supposed to stay strong? In 1 Samuel, little David defeats Goliath with an impressive confidence in God's help that illustrates what faith truly is. That is, trust that God is, at all times, good and always near at hand. David believes that he has never faced anything alone. The enemy he faced was formidable. 6 cubits, it's big, 10 feet tall. And we have to remember that people back then in those days were shorter. The greaves of bronze are shin guards, and the description of his armor, 126 pounds of it, tells us that there's only one vulnerable place in Goliath's huge person, his forehead. David's faithful courage then seems rooted not in his own physical prowess or skills or cunning, but in his experience of God acting in his life. And he counts on God to act again in the same way. That is, not only that God could act for good, but that God would act for good. One expression of faith that I've liked and that I've heard shared is a willingness to let God be God. If David is a hero that boasts, then it's God's power that makes him boast, not his own. Even when he describes for Saul his killings of bears and lions, he gives credit to God. The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. This is how David saw his own life. When he was out tending sheep, like a good shepherd, the future shepherd king, the greatest of Israel's kings, had to go battle lions and bears. And he rescued lambs from their very mouths. If a lion turned against him in the rescue, he'd catch it by the jaw and strike it down and kill it. As we listen to David's reassuring words to Saul, they don't sound like trash talking. Hey, I'm really strong and fierce. I'll take him on. Instead, we hear David say, God saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. And God will save me from this Philistine. He had it right. It wasn't about him. It was God's gifts working through David that made him strong and smart and able to bring down the threat of this giant Philistine. Goliath, the text says, fell face down on the ground. The people were saved. The Philistines fled. Young David's courage is in stark contrast to the disciples in the boat with Jesus. In the midst of the storm that frightens even these seasoned fishermen, who have surely seen plenty of storms themselves, in spite of the powerful things they've already seen Jesus do, they're certain that they're headed for destruction. Their question, don't you care that we are perishing? Don't you care? They ask. Instead of trusting Jesus, they feared a great fear. And meanwhile, Jesus slept in utter confidence that resembles David's calm before the giant. Just as Goliath was a threat to God's people, the storm is a great power that threatens the boatload of disciples. And it would be easy, of course, to reduce these readings to an assurance that nothing bad will ever happen to us, or that God will deliver us if it does. But we know that's not true. We've seen it this week among our families and congregation members. One thinks of the people in Hawaii experiencing terrible destruction from a volcano, or the people of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands still struggling to recover from devastating storms a year ago. The families broken by divorce or violence, of tragic accidents and purposeful deeds that bring heartache and loss. The news this week talked about children being kept in circumstances resembling cages and pens, separated by their parents as they flee a situation and conditions even worse than those that they were encountered. The message in this story is much more about God's presence with us in all circumstances. Nevertheless, we can't reduce that presence to a warm and fuzzy comfort, even. In fact, the story of Jesus calming the storm, we might also focus on the journey itself. After Jesus has been teaching for a while in the familiar and at least somewhat safe territory among his own people, he doesn't go home for a good night's sleep. Instead, he does that thing that restless seekers do. He sets out under the unfamiliar and the not so safe. Jesus is taking his disciples across the sea into Gentile territory. It's a significant move. It demonstrates that God works in everyone, not just in us and our own. We're all afraid of those who are other. But Jesus calls us to get out of our comfort zones and to move out into unfamiliar territory, confident that he will be with us all the way. Where is that place, that zone where we all need to take a risk in order to share God's gifts in us with others? All of us know what it feels like to feel small in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Illness, divorce, chronic pain, anxiety, the loss of loved ones, and the suffering of our children. We know what it feels like to face debt and financial fears and unsolvable problems, worries about our children, our job, our safety. We know what it feels like to be underappreciated, unnoticed, unacknowledged. Maybe we don't know what we're supposed to do with our life. Or we don't know how to help our family or to repair broken friendships. And then there are problems that we all share. Damage to the environment, pollution, war, and killing and violence, poverty and racism and sexism. Things that feel big and overpowering, and we feel so small in the face of these Goliaths, coming out of their camp every day and challenging us to do battle with them. But as David says, the battle is God's. It's God's power that will carry the day. Of course, it's not that we don't have to do anything. Like David, we have to throw off our heavy armor that we put on to protect ourselves. The armor that the world around us and its advisors tell us to use, our sense of security and self-sufficiency, our faith in money and possessions to keep us safe, our hoarding and our climbing and our positioning, and all that little and big justifications that we use to defend ourselves. We have to let God be God in us. We have to listen to that nagging deep inside and set aside our fears and put to use the gifts given to us, each and every one. We have to have faith, not that God will provide to us, but rather that God will provide through us. Let's pray. God, our source, as you work through David against the Philistines, work through us during all life's journey. Give us courage to risk danger. Give us courage to protect those who are oppressed and poor, that they may know you as their stronghold and hope. Amen.